Remember, remember, the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Anyone who's seen V for Vendetta knows that little refrain. And the face, if not the name, of Guy Fawkes has become pretty much world famous thanks to that movie and thanks to groups like Anonymous. But how many people know the real story of what happened on November 5th, 1605? Now, I hate to put a damper on all of this, but for a lot of reasons, a whole host of reasons, mainly related to the fact that we know today about deliberate forgeries and falsifications or destruction of documents that the government engaged in, the whole truth of what happened on that day is not likely to be known completely. However, there are some things in relation to this particular episode that I think would be very interesting and that I think we can learn a lot from. Now, for anyone who isn't familiar with what I'm referring to when I speak about the Gunpowder Plot, what I'm talking about is basically the story of what's commonly seen as the story of a group of renegade and very zealous Catholic noblemen who came together and conspired to place a large amount of gunpowder in one of the cellars underneath the Parliament building. And then on November 5th, 1605, when Parliament was scheduled to meet, to detonate the gunpowder, kill the king and all the lords inside. And that they did this, and that they were doing this because at the time Catholics were being very heavily persecuted, and this was sort of the way that these Catholic noblemen had come up with in their desperate situation to strike back against government persecution. Now, the standard account of this that's usually given goes a little bit like this, that on October 26th, 1605, and this is really what you could call the British court historian account, the pro-British state account. That on October 26, 1605, one dark and stormy night, William Parker, also known as Lord Monteagle, received a letter that was written in a very strange hand, very poorly written, and almost impossible to decipher, but which hinted vaguely at some sort of attack being planned on November 5th when Parliament was scheduled to meet. And this letter warned Monteagle not to be present for the opening of Parliament on that day. Terrified or confused, Monteagle decided immediately to take the letter, jump on his horse, and find the king and all the major nobles, reveal this letter to them, and then, so the story goes, King James, while looking at the letter, managed to determine that this plot, this attack that was vaguely alluded to in the letter, somehow involved gunpowder, and so around midnight, as midnight approached, right around midnight, November 5th, King James sent a group of men to do searches of all the cellars underneath the Parliament building, and one of these men, while conducting his search, found Guy Fawkes inside one of these cellars with an enormous quantity of gunpowder. He then called everyone else over. Fawkes was arrested, taken to the Tower of London, tortured, and he eventually confessed to the conspiracy, implicated his fellow conspirators, and those fellow conspirators were then rounded up and executed. That's the court historian account. In other words, the British government managed miraculously and for seemingly unexplainable, almost providential circumstances to avert disaster at the last moment. But I want to talk today about a book by Hugh Ross Williamson. Here it is, called The Gunpowder Plot, in which an alternative explanation is discussed. And Williamson starts off the book very interestingly. He says something right at the beginning to the effect that there is no doubt that on November 5th, 1605, some kind of plot involving gunpowder was unearthed, but it is still not known for sure whether it was a plot of Catholics against the government or of the government against the Catholics. And he makes the case in his book that although because of the many falsifications of documents, the many forgeries that I alluded to earlier, it's impossible to completely determine the truth. It is certainly possible to figure out that and to prove that the standard account as given by the government cannot possibly be true. And from this he proceeds to argue that it is at least possible that these Catholic noblemen that supposedly engaged against this conspiracy to destroy the government were actually set up by government agents. And that upon this setup, the government was able to portray Catholics as insane, overzealous, and crazy, and were thus able to pass whatever new laws they wanted to in the climate of fear that this produced and persecute Catholics to their heart's content. In other words, Williamson thinks in his book that the Gunpowder Plot was what today would be called a false flag operation. Now, although Guy Fawkes is seen as the face of the conspiracy, and he's the most famous one of them today, he wasn't really the central conspirator. The two men that either came up with the idea for this plot, or possibly had the idea implanted in their minds by some other government agent, were Robert Catesby and Thomas Winter. Now, the other three main conspirators, and there were others in addition to the five central men that I'll mention, but I'll focus on these five for now. In addition to Winter and Catesby, there were also Guy Fawkes, of course, a man named John Wright, who was a nobleman who was quite wealthy and whose connections they used to procure them, various houses that they could rent and go to and discuss plans. And he also rented, actually, the cellar under which the gunpowder was eventually placed. And the last man was a man named Thomas Percy, who, again, was a very wealthy Catholic nobleman, had great connections among the upper nobility in the court, and his connections allowed him to move around in the higher circles of government, and he was really, for the most part, the conspirators' inside man. Now, what is it that led these Catholic gentlemen to come up with this insane plot that ultimately failed? If today's terminology had been in use back then, the government would have surely called it an attempted terrorist attack. Well, in the late 16th century, under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, and then after her death into the early 17th century, leading up to the plot in 1605, under the reign of King James, Catholics were being persecuted quite severely in England. There were all sorts of laws passed, fining Catholics, imprisoning them, and making life difficult for them in all sorts of ways. And in the midst of this persecution, the Society of Jesus, otherwise known as the Jesuits, organized mass efforts to essentially send their operatives into England and sort of restore the spirits of their beleaguered fellow Catholics, as well as to try to convert as many other people as they could to Catholicism. And this earned the Jesuits really the absolute ire of the government and the special hatred of the state because of how they were attempting to thwart their plans of persecution. In addition to all of this persecution, and some of these laws were quite vicious. For instance, in 1581 and then in 1585, there were a whole series of laws passed where it became a felony to try to convert anyone to Catholicism. All Jesuits were expelled from England on pain of death. Anyone who wanted to go abroad to be educated, and the reason for this is that many Jesuits were in fact educated abroad, would have to first take the oath of supremacy, where they would swear that the Queen's authority superseded that of the Pope, which is something no Catholic could do. There were also laws that forbade Catholic masses, that fined anyone who was not present for Anglican services, and so on. So life for Catholics in England in the late 16th and early 17th century was very unpleasant. And in addition to this, And I'm sort of talking about this to give you an understanding of the kind of overall milieu. In addition to this, there was a large international conflict between England and Spain. And Spain, of course, was the preeminent Catholic nation at the time. And really, although religion was used to justify what was done in this conflict, it was very primarily a political one. Essentially, what happened is that Elizabeth tried to expand her power at the expense of King Philip II, who was King of Spain at the time. She would do things like hire an adventurer, a pirate, a mercenary, I guess you'd call him, by the name of Sir Francis Drake, to go to various Spanish colonial holdings with a fleet of ships and conduct devastating raids where he would just destroy everything that he could run into and pillage as much as he could. And then when it happened, Elizabeth would, deny involvement. But of course, Philip knew better, and these kinds of things sparked tensions between them. And as is well known, around this time, Philip sent a series of armadas to England, all of which, unfortunately, were thwarted by various occurrences. The weather would get out of control and destroy the Spanish fleet or something like this. But in the end, certainly by 1597, all of Spain's attempts to make war with England were failing, and Spain was beginning to feel the economic impact of it. And so, eventually, as the 17th century approached, Spain was running out of money and couldn't afford to conduct war with England anymore, and so began pursuing a policy of peace. Now, the more zealous Catholics, in the midst of their persecution, upon hearing this, were very disheartened. They looked to Spain as their hope, not only to save them from persecution, but possibly to restore England as a Catholic nation. And when all of these attempts to negotiate a peace on the part of the Spanish were, showing themselves to be increasingly genuine, the Catholics who were being persecuted, and who were both those who were still in England as well as those who had been expelled and fled abroad, were becoming increasingly desperate. Now, the Jesuits themselves, despite of their missionary efforts to help Catholics in England, were very adamant that they were not in favor of any kind of violent action to be undertaken against the government. And the Pope also issued many proclamations forbidding Catholics from doing this. But there was a subset of, I guess you'd call them, wilder spirits among the Catholics, who, in the desperation of their situation, decided to adopt violent measures. And this of course brings me to the 5 conspirators that I talked about. Now, I guess to give you a little bit of further background, Thomas Winter, again, was one of the men who possibly had come up with the idea for this plot. Although, in all likelihood, if any one of them came up with it, it was probably Catesby. But Thomas Winter was an intimate friend of Catesby's. Now, Winter was a very learned man. He spoke multiple languages, and he was quite a skilled diplomat. And so in December of 1601, he went on a diplomatic mission to Spain to try and ask once again for help from Spain for any kind of attempted Catholic insurrection against the English monarchy. They simply and flatly refused and told them that they didn't have the money to do anything like this. Now, at the same time, and by now, Queen Elizabeth had died, and there was a conflict as to who her successor would be. But everyone was quite sure that in all likelihood it would be King James of Scotland. So at the same time that Percy was over on his diplomatic mission into Spain, Thomas Winter was over on his diplomatic mission into Spain, Thomas Percy, another one of the conspirators, was sent to Scotland to meet with King James and try to secure from him a promise to be more tolerant towards Catholics. James, of course, gave this promise, but James was the kind of man who promised anything to anybody as long as it got him power. And when he came to power, he, of course, betrayed this promise and began persecuting Catholics more fiercely than ever. And upon realizing that this promise had been broken, the inner circle of conspirators grew quite desperate. And it so happened that around 1604, the summer of 1604, which is really when James began persecuting Catholics more strongly than ever, Robert Catesby, who was very charismatic and was from the start the leader of these conspirators, went to a Jesuit priest by the name of Father Henry Garnet and began asking him a series of very strange questions. He asked him things like, if in the midst of a war fought in favor of the Catholic faith, if it becomes unavoidable to kill innocents in order to achieve our objective, is it acceptable to do this? And of course, the priest tried his best to answer his questions, admitting that they were very difficult and that the murder of innocents is never justifiable even in dire circumstances. But upon receiving questions of this sort, Father Garnet became very suspicious and began to wonder if something wasn't afoot. And of course, right around this time is when the conspirators, Robert Catesby, Thomas Winter, Thomas Percy, John Wright, and Guy Fawkes, were beginning to concoct their plan. Now, Father Garnet, hearing about this, he didn't hear about it explicitly by then, but he was very suspicious and began pleading with Catesby not to do anything violent, and eventually secured a promise from Catesby that he wouldn't attempt anything and would at least wait for the Constable of Castile to visit England, and the Constable was scheduled to visit England in August of 1604. And would see what the result of this negotiation would be, because he had hoped, as many others Catholics had hoped, that it might still be possible that Spain would lend them some assistance. The Constable of Castile came, nothing came of it, and the Spanish proved to be quite sincere in their quest for peace with England. And so, at that point, the conspirators began to really form their idea of blowing up the Parliament building with a huge quantity of gunpowder. Now, as I sort of mentioned briefly, it's not known with certainty whether the idea was Catesby's or whether the idea possibly may have been implanted in Catesby's head by some government agent. Now, because any records that might prove this, and any records really concerning the real origin of the plot, have either been tampered with or destroyed entirely, it's impossible to completely know the truth. But what can be known with certainty is that the government knew in advance that this plot to blow up the Parliament building was afoot. They knew well in advance. In fact, they knew as early as April of 1604 that something was going on. And we know that the government knew because we have a letter written from a man by the name of Henry Wright, who was a friend of all of these conspirators and whom at some point the conspirators tried to bring into their inner circle, writing to Robert Cecil, who at the time was the Secretary of State, as well as to King James, telling them, and this was after the occurrence of the plot, telling them that all the way back in April of 1604, I told you that a certain group of Catholic gentlemen, and he even gave their names, would plan to plant a stash of gunpowder underneath the Parliament building and blow it up. So there's no doubt that as early as April of 1604, the government knew that these men were up to something. And once you realize that the government certainly did have knowledge of what was going on, the following events that I'm about to narrate begin to make much more sense. So in December of 1604, the five conspirators really set to their plan in earnest and had become completely serious about going ahead with it. And so Thomas Percy rented a house not far from the Parliament building, and the original plan was to dig an underground tunnel from this house all the way to the Parliament building, create sort of a compartment underneath the building where they could store all of the gunpowder and then safely detonate it. Now, they had set to doing this mining work as I said, in December of 1604. Now, there were four men originally who set to work on this: Catesby, Winter, John Wright, and Thomas Percy. Fawkes stood guard. Now, they actually managed to successfully dig this tunnel from where their sort of house was located to the Parliament building, and they did this in the space of about 2 weeks, which is quite astonishing given that none of these men, with the exception of Fawkes, had any mining experience whatsoever, and as I just said, Fawkes wasn't doing any digging. Now, there is after working on this tunnel for about 2 weeks, as I said, they reached the wall of the Parliament building, and then Parliament was originally set to meet on February 7th, 1605. So, seeing as how they started on December 11th and it took them 2 weeks to get to the wall, they had about 6 weeks to tunnel through this wall. Unfortunately for them, they had no sophisticated tools at all, and the wall was about 11 feet thick. So, there seemed to be nothing they could do. Then, suddenly, for completely unexplainable and mysterious reasons, Parliament decides to delay meeting again, and no reason was given for this. They delayed their intended meeting from February 7th to October 26th. Now, this seems mysterious, but once you remember that the government had known about what these conspirators were up to since April of 1604, this makes quite a bit more sense. Now, also around this time, there was a cellar, and this cellar was ultimately the cellar where Guy Fawkes was eventually found. Was at that time being rented by a coal merchant, and he was keeping a large quantity of coal in that cellar. Right around this same time, for again mysterious reasons were never given, the merchant decides to vacate this cellar, and Thomas Percy, seeing this opportunity open up, immediately decides to rent out this cellar, and the conspirators move all of their gunpowder into it. Now, later, again, after the conspirators had been caught, the government claimed that they had hidden this tunnel so well that no one could find it. And when you actually look at whether there's any physical evidence in relation to whether this tunnel existed at all, there really is none. So there's a good chance that this whole tunnel story was made up by the government after the fact. I don't have time to go into detail about why, but there's reason to believe that that whole tunnel story was falsified. But in any event, in one way or another, it seemed quite clear that the conspirators were being manipulated. Now, in addition to preparing all of this gunpowder to blow up the Parliament building, Catesby had another side to his plan. He also wanted to go to as many wealthy and influential Catholic noblemen as he could, tell them not everything about the plot, because he was quite certain that many of them would be repulsed by it and horrified by it, but he would tell them as much as they needed to know and try to convince them to get as many soldiers and weapons together as they could, so that when the Parliament building was blown up as it was planned to be, the conspirators could lead an uprising against the government and, take it over and oust everybody. So he was, while all this was going on, Catesby was also trying to form this army together. Now that I've mentioned, more or less who the conspirators were, I should take a brief moment to talk about the three principal, well, really four if you include King James, principal members of the government who, according to Williamson, were manipulating things from behind the scenes. The first and most important of them was the man I mentioned briefly, Robert Cecil, the Secretary of State. Now, he, as well as his two associates, his two partners in crime, Edward Cook and William Wade, who I'll also be talking about, had a special hatred for Catholics. Cecil in particular, because his family was one of the families that was eventually ennobled by Henry VIII some decades before the events I'm describing, when Henry VIII declared himself head of Church of England. And so Cecil saw any resurgence of Catholicism as essentially being a threat to his own power. And so, in order to preserve his own position, he did everything he could to persecute Catholics to the greatest extent that he could get away with. And this was also true of his other two associates, as I said, Edward Coke and William Wade. Edward Coke at the time, and his name is spelled C-O-K-E, but it's pronounced Cook, was the Attorney General. And he was well known for manipulating evidence, hiring forgers to take confessions and change them to say things that he wanted to say. And there is evidence of this going on in the case of the Gunpowder Plot conspiracy, where there are actually numerous copies of confessions of Guy Fawkes and Thomas Winter that were stored away in government archives, but which have notes written in the margins or lines underlined saying strike this out or remove this sentence or add this, and they were written in either Cook's handwriting or Cecil's handwriting or even King James's handwriting himself in some cases. So these men engaged in all of this falsification. Cook was also well known for being able to very eloquently harangue the accused in any trial that he was present at, so he could make a saint seem like the devil himself. And during the trial of the conspirators, he invoked this eloquence to devastating effect. Then there was also William Wade, who was essentially, again, a man elevated to his position entirely by Cecil, and who would do whatever Cecil wanted him to do, who very much enjoyed persecuting Catholics. He was of a very sadistic bent. In many cases, he's known to have taken certain Catholic prisoners and tortured them off the books in order to get them to confess whatever the government wanted them to confess, and then saying after the fact that said prisoner confessed the following of his own free will without a threat of torture. So these are some evil men manipulating things behind the scenes and working with the government here. And as I said, these men knew about a year and a half in advance of this Gunpowder Plot. Now, so the conspirators had their gunpowder in place in the cellar, and Catesby had his army. And while recruiting this army, he went to many people, most prominently two young men, two young, very wealthy Catholic noblemen, named Ambrose Rookwood and Sir Everard Digby. And these two young men really fell under Catesby's spell, because Catesby was an extraordinarily charismatic man of action. During the trial, many of the conspirators had essentially said that the only reason that they were dragged into doing what they did was by the force of Catesby's personality. He had convinced them this was necessary, that they were in a desperate situation. And who knows, he could have been right. This is sort of one of the questions that it's the intention of my video to make everyone ponder. But so these men were dragged in, and their resources were used to raise this army. But of course, it didn't work out. Fawkes was caught. Now, another interesting thing about the government's official account of this is that there are numerous documents describing how it is that Fawkes was discovered. One says, and this is the official one, the one that was given forward for public consumption, the so-called King's Book, as it was later called, which was sort of a compendium, an official version, telling the story. And in the King's Book, it said that it was King James that ordered the search, but there are other documents which were kept hidden in government archives and not really exhumed until much later to be examined by later historians, that said different things, that said, no, it was actually the Lords of Parliament that ordered the search and that James was against it, or that nobody ordered the search and that one of the men was just one of the groundskeepers was just making his rounds and discovered Fawkes by accident. There are all these conflicting accounts, and there really is no reason to believe any one of them over any other, because I mean, they're all there. There's a document that says each of these things, and that sort of suggests that perhaps this was something that the government invented after the fact and then decided on the story that seemed most plausible. Now, after Fawkes was caught, Catesby and Winter quickly realized what had happened and realized that all was lost. But they didn't tell their fellow conspirators about this. Catesby had hoped that perhaps despite Fawkes being caught, it was still possible to use the army that they had raised to wage war against the government, and possibly they could hold their own. So he didn't tell anyone else about it, and he hoped to have this uprising be successful. Now, unfortunately, it didn't work because before too long, news of Fawkes' capture had spread, and the army that Catesby had raised began deserting in enormous numbers. And so eventually you had this situation where the government issued an order for the arrest of Winter, Percy, Catesby, and all the other conspirators, and their men were deserting them in droves. And the conspirators were eventually led to a mansion that one of them had owned, called Holbeach House, where they essentially had their last stand. Catesby was killed in the struggle. Percy was blinded. Winter was shot in the right arm with a crossbow and quite seriously injured. But after this, after the arrest of the conspirators, and after the arrest of the conspirators, they were, of course, locked up, tortured, and eventually brought to trial. But something very interesting that should be mentioned: Fawkes, who, remember, was caught immediately and was immediately taken to be tortured, did not confess, did not implicate any of the other conspirators until November 8th. However, on the morning of November 5th, a few hours before Fawkes was captured, the Cecil had written an order sending soldiers to interview all of the conspirators, from Thomas Percy to Everard Digby to Ambrose Rookwood and all the rest of them, all the people that they had spoken to the day before, on November 4th. Now, if Fawkes, according to the government version, didn't confess until November 8th and reveal the names of his fellow conspirators, how would the government even know who to search for and what people to interview? Because, as I said, this order was issued on the morning of November 5th. This fact alone is enough to blow the official government version to smithereens. But eventually, the conspirators were captured, and there was all sorts of attempts by Cecil to employ spies to manipulate the conspirators into admitting things. They especially wanted them to admit the involvement of Jesuit priests, because, as I said earlier, the government at the time had a special hatred for Jesuits, and they wanted to create this illusion that this whole gunpowder conspiracy was a grand plan by the Jesuits to try and topple the English government, and thereby garner public support for persecuting Jesuits as viciously as they would like to. Now, for the most part, the conspirators did not confess. One of them, I believe a man by the name of Thomas Bates, who was one of Catesby's servants, he was tortured into a false confession. And on the basis of this confession, the government went out and arrested Father Henry Garnett and Father Oswald Tesemond. Now, Father Garnett had actually been told earlier by Catesby of the plot, and this is after Garnett began having his suspicions. Catesby did eventually tell him, but he told him in confession, under the seal of confession. And no Catholic priest can, of course, reveal what he has been told in confession. So Garnett, quite stoutly said that all that I know I was told under the seal, and I cannot reveal it. Cecil tried to torture Garnett. He then tried to be nice to him. Garnett wouldn't reveal anything. And so eventually, in the end, all of the conspirators were executed, and they were executed in quite a brutal way. Let's see if I remember this. They were hanged, castrated, disemboweled, drawn and quartered, and beheaded. Pretty gruesome. And then, of course, after this, the government was able to propound their version of events. They tried to make it look like a grand Catholic conspiracy, when it was only really just a small handful of men, and it may not even have been their idea. This idea may have been implanted in them by a government agent, and even if it wasn't, they were nursed along the way by spies, by governmental spies. And the government essentially got most of what it wanted. Anti-Catholic feeling was at an all-time high, and they passed a series of incredibly draconian laws. One law said, for example, that there would be laws saying that Catholics could not be doctors, could not be lawyers, could not be members of corporations, could not be trustees, that all marriages between Catholics, unless approved by an Anglican minister, were null and void, that Catholics were not allowed to live within 10 miles of London, that Catholics who wanted to move more than 5 miles away from their home had to receive the explicit permission of a local magistrate to do this. There was also a law saying that any Catholic home could be searched for any reason at all, merely on the order of a magistrate. So Catholics would have their homes broken into at random, would have their property stolen. It was pretty horrible. The government got what it wanted. Now, if all of the reasons to think that this may have been a governmental conspiracy against Catholics sound rather strange to you, there are a few final points that I would like to mention. I admit that a lot of the things that I've mentioned are kind of circumstantial, and it is difficult to say anything conclusive because of how much we know that documents and evidence has been tampered with. But it is true that at this time, especially starting under Queen Elizabeth and then going into the reign of King James, the English government employed an enormous network of spies under the legendary and feared spy master Sir Francis Walsingham. And Walsingham's spy network really was the 17th and the 16th and 17th century equivalent of the NSA. Walsingham had spies everywhere. He had a team of masterful forgers who would examine the handwriting of prisoners and forge it perfectly so they could create false confessions. All sorts of things like this. This is in fact what was probably done with Thomas Winter's confession. It was probably forged. Information in it that Winter did not himself write was put in there. There are a couple of reasons to think why that was done. The most prominent of them being that Winter spelled his last name Wintour, according to the old Welsh spelling. But whenever the government referred to him in its own documents, his last name was spelled Winter. And if you look at Winter's confession, his name is spelled Winter, suggesting that it probably was forged. And there are also earlier versions of Winter's confession which contain, marginal notes and things underlined saying, remove this. So it was tampered with. There's also the fact that at this time the government liked to trump up and create these situations where there were supposed plots against the life of Queen Elizabeth. And this was incredibly popular during Queen Elizabeth's reign, and of course continued into King James's time. Williamson in his book mentions a few examples of these plots. There are so many of them, there's just no time to go over them all. But he mentions two in particular, one called the Babington Plot and another called Squire's Plot. And in the Babington Plot, there was a young Catholic gentleman, like I said, rather naive, by the name of Anthony Babington, who at the time was about 24 years old. And in one way or another, he managed to visit Mary Queen of Scots, who in the 1580s was the person that all the Catholics in England wanted to be the reigning English monarch. He visited Mary Queen of Scots while she was in prison, and it seems developed an infatuation for her. And he was manipulated by government agents into involvement in some kind of grand conspiracy, which also probably was not true. But he was manipulated into appearing to be involved with some conspiracy to assassinate Queen Elizabeth. And this, by the way, is something that all historians today admit was a setup. And conveniently, right around this time, in 1586, the government passes a law where it says that merely knowing about an attempt to assassinate the Queen is enough to get you the death penalty. And so Babington was arranged to write a letter, was sort of cajoled into writing a letter to Mary, saying that he knew of this conspiracy. Mary read the letter, which meant that she in turn also knew of the conspiracy, and so immediately in 1587, Mary was taken, and that's how Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed, and one of the principal challengers to Elizabeth's reign was removed. A similar absurdity was seen in Squire's plot. Edward Squire was kind of a soldier of fortune and an adventurer. He went on one of Francis Drake's raiding expeditions that I referred to earlier in my video here. In 1595, he got stranded, managed to find his way to Spain, tried to ingratiate himself with Spanish Jesuit priests who were extremely suspicious of him. That didn't work out, and by the time he returned to England, he was, for unexplainable reasons, arrested by the government and tortured into a false confession saying that Jesuit priests had instructed him to poison the Queen. Again, this is something that all historians today admit was made up. And so, despite the fact that we may not have conclusive ironclad proof that this was, in fact, a governmental conspiracy, we do know with certainty that enormous amounts of documents were falsified. We know that there were spies everywhere in the employ of the English government. We know that the technique of using plots to garner anti-Catholic sentiment was commonly employed by agents of the English state. We know all of these things, and so that should lead us at least to doubt the governmental story. Now, on top of all this, there's also the interesting question of gunpowder. In December of 1601, gunpowder was made a government monopoly in England, so only the English government could legally own gunpowder, and this, of course, begs the question, where the hell did the conspirators get so much gunpowder? Because although the estimates of how much gunpowder Fawkes had with him in the cellar vary, the smallest estimate is that he had about 3,600 pounds of gunpowder. And this, according to Williamson, this amount of gunpowder was about 1/4 of all of the gunpowder that the English government had in its own official storehouses for use during a war that it had been conducting in the 1580s and 1590s against a group of Irish rebels. So this is quite a lot of gunpowder. Now, what's interesting is that in 1604, there was a man hired to oversee all the government storehouses containing things like gunpowder. His name was Henry Bruckner. His name is spelled quite strangely, but I believe that's how it's pronounced. And in 1607, Bruckner died, and his son William took over his position. Now, shortly after attaining his position, William Bruckner wrote a letter to Robert Cecil asking that he be allowed to do an audit on the stores of gunpowder in the Tower of London, to check whether all the gunpowder that really was there was there. Cecil denied this request. Bruckner then wrote back to him saying that if he didn't grant him the request to do an audit, he would go to court and expose him. Now, he didn't explicitly say why he would go to court or what it is that he would expose, but it's very interesting that shortly after this great plot involving a massive quantity of gunpowder, somebody tries to do an investigation of some possible missing gunpowder, is denied, and then threatens to go to court. Cecil eventually capitulates, and he allows Bruckner to do an investigation, but provided that the investigation only covered the years 1578 to 1604. Now this again is circumstantial evidence, it doesn't conclusively prove anything, but you must admit it's a tad fishy. So when you look at this and you realize the possibility that this whole thing may have just been a setup, I mean, it just goes to show once again that those in power are never to be trusted. There is no lie they will not tell. There is no falsehood they will not concoct. There is no low they will not sink to preserve their position. And so, if there's any lesson to be learned from this Gunpowder Plot conspiracy, it's this. Now, also in addition to all of these obvious things about governmental lying, about manipulation, about just how evil and horrible the state is as an organization, this also brings up the question of under which circumstances is violent resistance to governmental oppression acceptable. Now, as I said, it's true that most Catholics, when they learned of the Gunpowder Plot, were horrified. The Jesuits were dead set against it. The Pope explicitly prohibited Catholics making use of violence in order to fight persecution. But Catesby is described in Williamson's book, I think in an excellent way. He's described as a Catholic on Protestant principles. That is, that he was a man who very much went his own way and didn't really have much respect for authority. And as I said, he was enormously charismatic. So he convinced all of these people to undertake this form of violent resistance. Now that doesn't mean that Catesby was wrong. I mean, there is, I think, a time where violent resistance to governmental oppression is justifiable. And so that's kind of what I want to end this video on. I want to ask to everyone here, under what circumstances is violent resistance to governmental oppression justifiable? And what happens if that violent resistance possibly involves, some, I hate to use this term, but collateral damage? Because had Catesby's plan gone as it was intended to go, there would, in all likelihood, have been a Catholic nobleman present at Parliament who would have been killed. In fact, this was one of Everard Digby's worries and objections against Catesby when he tried to bring him into the plot. Although, in fairness to Catesby, he did warn a lot of these Catholic noblemen of what would happen, and he contrived in many different ways to have many of them absent. But still, it is a valid and legitimate question. So yes, under what circumstances is violent resistance to government acceptable? And, given the whole recent issue now with Porkfest and the Free State Project and Christopher Cantwell, I think this is quite apropos. But moving aside even from all of this, seeing that this was probably a setup by the government, what's the lesson to be learned here? Well, I think the lesson is pretty obvious. As I said, there's nothing a lot of these government agents won't do. Never believe them. Never believe the government. It doesn't mean that everything the government says is a lie, but it means that it probably is. So, if anything, I would end it on this note. Remember that the greatest terrorist is usually the state itself. Thank you for listening. And the book, once again, is The Gunpowder Plot by Hugh Ross Williamson. I'll include a link to where you can buy it if anyone happens to be interested. When I bought that book, there were actually 3 copies left available for about $40. The publisher's going out of print. I bought one of those 3 copies. There are still 2 left, and all of the others that are for sale are either used or they're very expensive. So if you want to buy the book, do it now. And that's it. Thank you.